Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 94th deck and also the last deck we're going to be doing in 2022. So hopefully you'll check out some of the new decks in 2023. But the title of this deck is going to be Tricycle Sidecar. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So very quickly, before we get into the actual deck tech itself, I do want to take a second to highlight some of our social media accounts and ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. So first off, you can find us over on Twitter at 13POYNZ, Reddit u/POYNZ13, email dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. All of those are great ways to reach out to us if you ever have any questions, you want to suggest some cards that you would like to see on the show, or just kind of getting to know us, having some conversations. I usually try to post as much as I can there to interact with people, so if that's what you're looking to do, those are great ways to do it. And then finally, if you're looking to support the channel a little bit more directly, you can go on over to our TCG Player affiliate link, which is in the description of this video. Once you've clicked on that, any cards you purchase for any decks you may be looking to build, we get a little bit of a kickback from, just as a thank you for sending you over to TCG Player. And then finally, the most direct way that you can help support us is Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide. Right now, all of the proceeds that we are getting from that are going toward figuring out ways to record games in person. I know I've been saying that for a long time. I think I've finally figured it out. I'm just working on getting there. But once you have subscribed to us over on Patreon, you can look forward to things like getting the deck lists a week early, so you get access to all of the decks an entire week early. You could also get access to a Discord channel where we brew up some of the decks, we build them, you can help suggest them, and you can even play in some of the games that show up on this channel if that's something you're interested in doing. You can also get one of our random cards sent to you every single month as a thank you for all of your support. And probably one of the most entertaining things you get out of it is seeing the unedited gameplay videos where you get to hear all of the players interacting with each other and kind of talking and laughing and enjoying themselves rather than just my own commentary and the shortened aspect of it. And then, of course, you also get access to the guarantee that any cards you suggest to be turned into videos for this channel, I will make them into videos at some point. It might take me a while, if I'm being perfectly honest, but I will get there eventually. I can't promise that to anybody but our patrons, so if that is something you are interested in doing, please do check it out. And as always, we got to shout out our 4 current patrons. We do have William Swiftfoot, who you'll actually see later on as he participates in a game that we're going to play later. You'll also get Doodle. We've also got Calvin Schmidt, and we also have Eric Hui. So to the 4 of you, thank you all so much. And if none of that sounds like your style, or maybe you just can't give right now, I completely understand. Times are hard for everybody. You can always just like the video, subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. And I suppose, without any further ado, let's actually jump into our deck tech. So we got to start, of course, with our random card of the week. And this is a random card. It's not suggested to us by anybody. And that card is Splendor Mare. And Splendor Mare is 2 and a white for a 3/3 creature, elk unicorn. It's got lifelink. It has cycling for 1 and a white, which means we can pay 1 and a white, discard this card from our hand, and draw a card. And then, whenever we cycle Splendor Mare, we put a lifelink counter on target creature we control. So I wasn't 100% sure how I wanted to build this deck when I first got this card, but I went kind of the obvious way, which I know could sound kind of boring with our commander, but it'll make sense in a second because we're going to talk about a lot of the synergies that this card has with Gavi Nest Warden. So Gavi Nest Warden is 2 blue, red, white for a 2/5 legendary creature human shaman. You may pay 0 rather than pay the cycling cost of the first card you cycle each turn. And whenever you draw your second card each turn, create a 2/2 red and white dinosaur cat creature token. So this allows us to cycle our Splendor Mare for 0 mana, meaning we can cycle it, put a lifelink counter on anything that's on the board, and then also, if it's our turn, we get to make a cat. If it's not our turn, then maybe we can cycle something else and still make a cat. So that is the general gist of what we're trying to do. And of course, we do, as always, have some themes that go along with this. if you haven't been able to guess already, our first theme is going to be cycling. We want to basically take all the cards in our hand, put them in the graveyard, and then draw a bunch of other cards. So the main idea there is that we want to play as many cards with cycling as possible, and that includes cards like Censor, which is 1 and a blue for an instant, counter target spell unless its controller pays 1, and cycling for a blue. So most of the cycling cards that we're playing, because there are quite a few in our colors, I wanted to make sure that we had cards that were going to be relevant for us, cards that have some sort of utility. So Censor, early on in the game, we can use it to counter someone's commander maybe, we can use it to counter some big board wipe that people need to cast, whatever it might be. And then, if we ever don't need it, we can just cycle it away. So Censor, very good card. It actually shows up quite a bit in 60-card formats, things like Pioneer and Explorer and things like that. So definitely worth a slot in the deck, but that's the general theme of what we're trying to do. Just, we want to cycle cards. We want to get them out of our hand. And then that leads us directly into our next key theme, which is going to be cards that actually care about us cycling cards. Because, yeah, cycling cards is great. And yeah, we're making cats with Gavi, but if we're not really doing anything else, then what's the point of it? So we have cards like Drannith's Stinger, which is 1 and a red for a 2/2 human wizard, that says whenever you cycle another card, Drannith's Stinger deals 1 damage to each opponent, and it has cycling for 1. Now, obviously, this isn't going to kill all of our opponents, because if we're talking about killing them all from their starting life totals, we're taking them from 40 to 0. We would have to cycle a total of 40 cards, and believe it or not, that is a possibility with this deck. You could do that, but I can't imagine that's going to happen very often. More likely, though, this is going to be used to kind of get in that last bit of damage, kind of chip people down, make sure that we're controlling people's life totals rather than just knocking them out all at once. And we do have other cards that care about us cycling things, because we want to make sure that every time we cycle something, we're getting some form of value other than just the card that we're drawing. So that is kind of where we're coming from with Drannith's Stinger. And then finally, our last theme, which is surprisingly, well, or maybe not surprisingly at this point, also on a cycling card, that is going to be tokens. There are a ton of cards that make tokens when you cycle something. So we are leaning pretty heavily into that theme, and we want to make as many tokens as possible, because that is going to be our win condition with this deck. Gavi on her own makes cat tokens, Valiant Rescuer here makes human soldier tokens, and we have things that make Drake tokens, we have things that make Kraken tokens. We have a ton of ways to make sure that we are making as many tokens as possible. And so what that's doing for us is we're going to be using Valiant Rescuer, which is 1 and a white for a 3/1 human soldier. Whenever you cycle another card for the first time each turn, create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token, and it has cycling for 2. So we can, of course, just cycle it away if that's something we need to do, or maybe we just don't need it at the time. But if we have it in play, we can make at least 1/1 soldier every single turn. And yeah, it's only making 1. We couldn't do this a ton of times, but you've got to remember too that Gavi allows us to cycle 1 card for free every single turn. So we can, on our turn, cycle something for free, make a soldier. On the next opponent's turn, cycle something for free, make a soldier. On the next opponent's turn and the next opponent's turn. So if we have something in our hand to cycle every single turn, we can get 4 soldiers every single go around the table. And that doesn't sound like a ton right away, but it really starts to build up over time. And then if we add into that the fact that maybe each opponent took 4 damage as we went around the table because of Drannith's Stinger, we're going to start to really chip away at our opponent's life totals and make sure that no matter what we're doing, we're always increasing the board state. We're always making sure that we're putting things into play, we're doing damage, and we're eventually going to be able to close out the game with our tokens, with our cycling, and with our cycling enablers. So that is the deck in a nutshell. And of course, we do have to take a look at some key cards, some cards that may not necessarily win us the game on their own, but are either great value engines, great pieces to this, or, well, in some cases, do just win the game on their own. So the first of those that we've got to talk about is a personal favorite card of mine. I actually play this card in Pioneer quite a bit. That is New Perspectives. New Perspectives is 5 and a blue for an enchantment. And it says, when it enters the battlefield, draw 3 cards, and as long as you have 7 or more cards in hand, you may pay 0 rather than pay cycling costs. Gavi lets us cycle for 0 for the first card each turn. New Perspectives lets us do it for every single card. And since the vast majority of our deck is full of cycling cards, this means we can churn through our deck at an alarming rate, making sure that we're making a ton of soldiers, doing a ton of damage, and it's not outside of the realm of possibilities that if we have something like Drannith's Stinger and New Perspectives, we could actually cycle the 40 cards needed to just knock all of our opponents out of the game. So New Perspectives is a phenomenal card, and it's really a great way to just churn through your entire deck, draw the cards you need, cast the cards you need, and then just keep cycling. So New Perspectives, awesome card. A bit of a combo piece. There's no direct way to win with this card in the deck, but it is definitely worth the include. And then that leads us to our second key card, and that is going to be Drakehaven. Yet another win condition, although it's not necessarily going to win the game on its own. It is 2 and a blue for an enchantment. Whenever you cycle or discard a card, you may pay 1. If you do, create a 2/2 blue Drake creature token with flying. So what Drakehaven does for us is give us the ability to make many tokens, because things like Gavi, it's only going to make us 1 token a turn. The Valiant Rescuer, only going to make us 1 token a turn. Drakehaven, though, Drakehaven lets us make as many tokens as we have mana. And if we have Gavi or New Perspectives and we're cycling for free, it's literally just cycle something for free, pay 1 mana, make a 2/2 flyer. And while a 2/2 flyer isn't going to close out the game on its own, at least I hope it's not. If it does, then the game might be taking a little bit too long. But we can make an army of 2/2 flyers, and it doesn't take long before they really start to add up, and we start to do a ton of damage to our opponents because they're blockable, yeah, but you don't really want to throw valuable flyers in front of just random tokens that can keep coming back. So Drakehaven puts in a ton of work and really makes sure that we have bodies on board and we have a payoff for all of our cycling cards. And then finally, we get to our last key card, and this one is slightly different than the first two, but it still plays into our strategy, and that is going to be Astral Slide. So New Perspectives and Drakehaven are all about the value and making sure that we're getting a ton of card draw, we're getting a ton of tokens. Astral Slide is about protecting ourselves. Astral Slide is 2 and a white for an enchantment that says whenever a player cycles a card, so it doesn't have to be us, it could be anybody, you may remove target creature from the game. If you do, return that creature to play under its owner's control at the end of turn. Now, we could use this on our own creatures, use it to rebuy any enter the battlefield effects that we have, but in all honesty, we don't have a ton of them. What it's really here for is protection, because if our opponents are attacking us with their commander that has 21 power, we can just cycle a card, exile it, and bring it back at the end of turn. It's obviously not going to save us if the creature has hexproof or shroud, but it's a great way to get around anything that could be attacking us that we don't necessarily want to attack us. We could also use it offensively by making a ton of drakes, and then before we go to attack, cycle a bunch of cards to exile our opponent's blockers, making sure that we can get in for damage. So whether we're using it offensively or defensively, Astral Slide is an absolute all-star in this deck, and it does have a bit of a twin. It's got Astral Drift as well, which is very similar, but it doesn't count all players, it only counts us, and it itself cycles. So we do have a backup for Astral Slide in case it gets destroyed. But I wanted to talk about Slide just because it is slightly better once it's in play than Astral Drift is. But those are our key cards for the week, and the next piece of this deck tech is to take a look at some cool interactions, some cards that synergize very well together, and I think work just kind of in unique ways. So the first of this is going to be Crystalline Resonance and Yadaro Wandering Monster. And I know looking at these two, you might be thinking to yourself, why in the world would we care about this? And I'll explain it in a second. First off, let's read some of the cards. So Crystalline Resonance is 2 and a blue for an enchantment. Whenever you cycle a card, you may have Crystalline Resonance become a copy of another target permanent until your next turn, except it has this ability. Yadaro Wandering Monster is 5 red for an 8/8 trample haste. It's got cycling for 1 and a red. When you cycle Yadaro Wandering Monster, shuffle it into your library from your graveyard. If you've cycled a card named Yadaro Wandering Monster 4 or more times this turn, put it onto the battlefield from your graveyard instead. Now, obviously we don't want to copy Yadaro with Crystalline Resonance because it is legendary, so one of them would have to die. But the nice thing about this is that we can actually cycle Yadaro for 1 in a red, which is very, very cheap, or maybe even free if we have New Perspectives or Gavi, turn Crystalline Resonance into something else, and then Yadaro is going to shuffle itself back into our deck, or possibly even come into play. And that's really where it shines, because we could have no creatures on board with a Crystalline Resonance. We've cycled Yadaro 3 times, and our opponents don't expect us to really have anything. Then we cycle Yadaro, we turn Crystalline Resonance into the best thing that our opponents have. It has haste because it's been in play this whole time. And then we also get Yadaro out of our hand, or in this case out of the graveyard, back into play as an 8/8 trample with haste. So we can do a ton of damage out of nowhere for literally 2 mana that we could use to cycle Yadaro. And in some cases, like I said earlier with Gavi or New Perspectives, we could do this for absolutely free as long as we have Crystalline Resonance already in play. So that is why I think these two work very well together, because they're really just kind of a surprise. They can both kind of come out of nowhere. And the nice thing with Crystalline Resonance in particular is it keeps the ability to change into something else. So if someone goes to, say, kill the creature that Crystalline Resonance turns into, we could actually turn it into maybe, say, a land, because it doesn't say target non-land permanent, and then all of a sudden that murder that they use to kill the creature fizzles because it's actually now targeting a land. So Crystalline Resonance is just on its own an all-star in this deck, as is Yadaro, but I do think that combined they kind of play into a unique space that not a lot of other cards in this deck can do. So that is cool interaction number 1. And then our next cool interaction is going to be between Ormos Archive Keeper and Fluctuator. Now, before I get into this cool interaction, I do want to point out that we are not running cards like Thassa's Oracle or Laboratory Maniac in this deck. We don't have any cards that say if you would draw a card while there's no cards left in your library, you win the game. Instead, I wanted to put in Ormos Archive Keeper, which is 4 blue for a 5/5 legendary creature Sphinx. It has flying, and if you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, instead put 5 +1/+1 counters on Ormos Archive Keeper. You can also pay 1 blue, discard 3 cards with different names, and draw 5 cards. So I don't anticipate us ever really getting to that point. I suppose it's always possible, but I wanted to put in a card that stopped us from losing the game in case we do start to draw our entire deck, but doesn't straight up win us the game like Laboratory Maniac or Thassa's Oracle, because those kind of can have some feel bad moments to them, so I wanted to avoid that. And so the reason that I wanted to include Ormos in this cool interactions part is because if we combine that up with Fluctuator, which is 2 mana for an artifact that says cycling abilities you activate cost up to 2 less to activate, we might just possibly draw through our entire deck, because there's a lot of cycling cards that cost 1 or 2, a lot of cards that just become free with Fluctuator, or even if they don't become free, they allow us to get to the point where we then have Gavi to cycle for free, or we then have New Perspectives to cycle everything for free. So it's not beyond the realm of possibilities that we get to, well, the end of our deck with Ormos, so it's important that we have Ormos to kind of stop us from going too far with Fluctuator. I'm not going to lie, in my playtesting with this deck, I never reached that point, but there were a few times where I came very close, so it is a possibility, but it's not something I would expect to happen every single time. Hopefully you're winning the game before you get to that point, but I suppose you never really know, and it's just kind of there as a safety valve. So those are our cool interactions. And the very last thing we've got to do for this deck tech is talk about the budget. And there's, of course, 2 aspects of the budget. There's the out-of-budget upgrade section, and there's the total budget. Now, before we get into the actual budget of this deck tech, I want to take a second to just kind of highlight the fact that every card we've talked about so far has been under $1. There has not been a single card we've mentioned that has cost us more than $1 to put in this deck. So before we get to the actual price of the deck, I would recommend maybe just take a guess as to yourself how much this deck might cost. We'll give you a quick second. And then The actual price of this deck comes out to a whopping total of $19.09. So if you are looking for a super budget-friendly deck, this deck is literally less than $20. Almost every single card in the entire deck is less than $1, and there's actually only 2 cards that are over $1, and, well, let me rephrase that. There were 2 cards that were over $1 when I built the deck. Actually, since I've built it, one of them has dropped below $1, meaning that there's only 1 card in this entire deck that is worth more than $1, and that is Decree of Annihilation. And I know I'm going to get all the hate in the comments. Yes, this is mass land destruction in a deck that is $20, and yeah, that can be a little bit brutal, but let me explain myself on this one. So, Decree of Annihilation is a massive 8 red, so 10 total mana for a sorcery that says remove all artifacts, creatures, lands, graveyards, and hands from the game. We are never going to be casting this for its full cost. If you're casting it, you're probably not in a great position to be winning the game because you no longer have any resources, and I'll be honest, this deck doesn't do super great when it doesn't have the resources it needs to cycle its cards. However, it does have a cycling cost for 5 red, and it says when you cycle Decree of Annihilation, destroy all lands. Yes, I know this is a very mean card. But the reason that this is in here is because with Gavi, making sure that all of our stuff costs 0 to cycle, and making us a cat token every single time on our turn when we draw 2 cards, we can get out ahead of our opponents by destroying all the lands and still actually being able to execute our game plan, while hopefully shutting down everybody else's game plan. Now, obviously, this is a very contentious card, and I do understand that, so if you put this deck together and your playgroup isn't okay with mass land destruction, I would obviously make sure to either take it out or at least mention it before the game starts. I am personally very bad at the Rule 0 conversation. I tend to forget a lot of the cards in my deck. I'm just a very forgetful person in general. So I'm sure there will be times when I forget to mention it, but hopefully with the little public service announcement here, maybe you won't fall into that same trap. So that is our most expensive card. Obviously, if you have to take it out, just go ahead and do so. It's, not even $2. You could very easily take it out and replace it with plenty of other sweet cycling cards that exist. However, this is a $20 deck. If you are looking to actually increase the price of this deck, there are a couple of cycling cards that, while if I'm being perfectly honest, I could fit into the budget of this deck, I chose not to because I thought it might be kind of cool to see how low we could get the price of the deck. And I do think $19.09 is pretty impressive. I'm very happy with how that turned out. However, like I said, I do have 2 out-of-budget upgrades. The first of which is going to involve the same cycle as Decree of Annihilation, so in all honesty, it is kind of a mean card, but that is going to be Decree of Silence, and I would recommend swapping that in and taking out Escape Protocol. So, Decree of Silence is 6 blue, again, most likely never going to be cast, but maybe you do, for an enchantment that says whenever an opponent plays a spell, counter that spell and put a depletion counter on Decree of Silence. If there are 3 or more depletion counters on Decree of Silence, sacrifice it. But it also has cycling for 4 blue. When you cycle Decree of Silence, you may counter target spell. So first off, if we cast it, we are preventing our opponents from casting the next 3 spells that they play, because it straight up just counters the next 3 spells they cast, then it puts counters on Decree of Silence, and then sacrifices it after 3. That is a very rough situation to put your opponents in, because nobody wants to be the person who's got to cast the spells that get countered. So a lot of times this is going to draw a lot of attention to you. People are going to attack you. People are going to try to remove your stuff. And they're probably going to succeed because unless you have a ton of tokens going, you're not going to be doing too much. But there is a chance that you survive the onslaught and just use it to win. But the real reason that I wanted to include this in the out-of-budget upgrade section is because if you have Gavi, that cycling cost of 4 blue becomes 0, and you can now cycle Decree of Silence for 0 mana on an opponent's turn for what is essentially a free counterspell. So no more Force of Will, Force of Negation, Fierce Guardianship, any of those super duper expensive like $40, $50, $100 cards that counter things for 0 mana. This is $9, counter something for 0 mana, and draw a card. So this is incredibly powerful in a Gavi deck and works its way into stopping a lot of situations that you wouldn't expect a $20 deck to be able to deal with. And so if you have the card just sitting around or you've got the money to spend on it, I would highly recommend slotting it in. And the card that I would recommend taking out, Escape Protocol, is 1 and a blue for an enchantment. Whenever you cycle a card, you may pay 1. When you do, exile target artifact or creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. Now, Escape Protocol can be very powerful. It's a great way to save your creatures from removal or your artifacts from removal, making sure you can save Gavi if she needs to be saved, or maybe a mana rock, something like that. But the most important thing that this is going to do in saving a creature is unfortunately not going to be that relevant in this deck, as weird as that sounds, because a lot of times we're going to be making so many tokens and going so wide with our board that if an opponent kills Gavi, it's not that big of a deal. We can just recast her and keep going. The really big thing that's going to get us is going to be board wipes. So if someone destroys all the creatures, that's where it's really going to hurt. And unfortunately, Escape Protocol can't really deal with that because it immediately brings the creatures back and then they just die to the board wipe anyway. On the other hand, though, Decree of Silence can cycle to just straight up counter the board wipe. So that is why I think Decree of Silence is going to be better in most situations than Escape Protocol, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you think that it's the other way around. So please do let me know in the comments which of these you think is better, because I would definitely be interested in hearing those conversations. And then finally, we got one more out of budget upgrade. I won't talk quite as long about this one because this one's pretty obvious. This one is going to be Rogran Triome, and you can just replace any basic land. I suggested an island just because we don't have quite as much blue in the deck as the other two colors. But Rogran Triome is a land. It's an island, mountain, and plains. It enters the battlefield tapped, and it has cycling for 3. So obviously, you should try to include as many lands with cycling in the deck as possible, because that's really what's going to help your mana base shine. It's really going to help if you start to kind of flood out, get too many lands. But Rogran Triome is, of course, $10, so it's not in the deck right now because I didn't want to spend an entire third of our deck price on a single land. But if you've got an extra one, or you just want to have the deck be as efficient as possible, it really is worth the include. So those are all of our out of budget upgrade sections. And the last thing we've got to do with the deck, the actual last thing this time, is see how it's going to perform in a game. So we are going to run this deck up against 3 separate opponents and see how it performs. And our opponents this week are going to be William Swiftfoot playing Nazan Revered Bladesmith, Mikayla playing Tyam Luminous Enigma, and Bilal playing Beladros Witherbloom. So starting off with William's deck, this is a cat artificer and a, what's the word I'm looking for? An equipment deck. There it is, an equipment deck. So he wants to play as many equipments as possible and make sure that he is equipping all of his creatures, making them nice and big, swinging in for tons of damage. And because he can use Nazan to get the Hammer of Nazan, he can guarantee to give any creature he wants indestructible, make sure that he can kind of skip the equip costs of things, bring things in for free. There's going to be a lot of shenanigans with equipments and artifacts from his deck. And I'm hoping that we can get something like an Astral Drift or Astral Slide into play to kind of exile his creatures, get all the equipments off of them, try to keep him slowed down, but we'll see if that's something we can do, or maybe we can just overwhelm him with tokens. Not 100% sure, but we'll see. And then next up, we have Mikayla and her Tyam deck. And this is a unique mix of a deck between a Soul Sister style deck, so she wants to be gaining a ton of life and playing creatures that gain a bunch of life, and then also a counter style deck. So she wants to put a bunch of counters on her creatures, particularly vigilance counters with Tyam, making sure that her creatures, when they get big with other counters, can just attack and not really have to worry about not being able to block. So I'm very interested to see how this deck goes. I don't think I've ever played against a Tyam deck before, so I'd like to see what happens there. And then finally, we have Bilal's Beladros Witherbloom deck, and I'm going to be perfectly honest up front, this is by far the deck that I am the most concerned about, because this deck is just a house. It's very similar to Mikayla's in the sense that it wants to play a bunch of the Soul Sister effects, wants to gain a bunch of life, but he's going to be using that life to untap his lands and get a ton of value. So he's going to find ways to make use of double the mana, make sure that he can always have his life up so he can always have access to that double mana, and also using ways of gaining life to kind of hurt his opponents, ways that whenever he gains life, an opponent loses life, and that sort of thing. So that is easily my most concerned deck at the table. We'll have to see how our deck does. We'll see if our $20 cycling deck can hold up against such awesome opponents. And hopefully you liked the deck tech and you like the gameplay that's coming up. And I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, William goes first, followed by Mikayla, Bilal, and then myself. On William's first turn, he plays a Plains. Mikayla plays an Evolving Wilds, sacrificing it to search her library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Bilal plays a Swamp and casts Valentine, Dean of the Vein, exiling any creatures that would die under an opponent's control. I play a Desert of the True. William plays a Forest and casts Fyndhorn Elves. Mikayla plays a Forest and casts Arcane Signet, and then casts Essence Warden, gaining a life whenever a creature enters the battlefield. Bilal plays a Forest and then attacks me for 1, gaining a life thanks to lifelink. I play a Mountain and cast Lightning Rift, letting me pay a mana whenever a player cycles a card to do 2 damage to any target. William plays a Canopy Vista, and then casts Open the Vaults, searching his library for an equipment, in this case a Sword of the Animist, putting it into his hand. He then casts the Sword of the Animist and passes. Mikayla plays a Swamp and casts her own Valentine, Dean of the Vein, gaining a life, and then casts Elixir of Immortality, which can be activated to gain her 5 life and shuffle her graveyard into her library. Bilal plays a Forest and casts Willow Dusk Essence Seer, which can be activated to put a number of +1/+1 counters on a creature equal to the life he has either gained or lost this turn. This also gains Mikayla a life, and he then attacks me for 1, gaining himself a life with Valentine. On my turn, I play an Island. On William's turn, he plays a Forest and casts Stonehaven Outfitter, giving his equipped creatures +1/+1 and letting him draw a card when an equipped creature dies, also gaining Mikayla a life. He then equips the Sword of the Animist to Fyndhorn Elves, and attacks Mikayla for 3, since the Fyndhorn Elves gets an additional +2/+2 and lets him search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped when it attacks. Mikayla plays a Forest, and casts Cliffhaven Vampire, making each opponent lose a life whenever she gains a life, which triggers immediately as she gains a life from Essence Warden. Bilal plays a Swamp, and casts Explosive Vegetation, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. Then, at the end of turn, I cycle a Rune of Protection lands, paying an extra mana to do 2 damage to Essence Warden, killing it. Notably, it should have been exiled because of Valentine, but we don't catch that at the time. On my turn, I play a Lonely Sandbar and cast Flourishing Fox, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever I cycle a card. William plays a Forest and casts his commander Nazan Revered Bladesmith. When he enters, William searches his library for an equipment, in this case Hammer of Nazan, putting it into play and immediately equipping it to Stonehaven Outfitter. This gives it +2/+0, indestructible, and lets him equip any equipment for free when they enter the battlefield under his control. He then casts Mask of Memory, equipping it for free to Stonehaven Outfitter, letting William draw 2 cards and discard a card when it deals combat damage to a player. He moves to combat, attacking Mikayla for 5, searching his library for a basic land and putting it into play tapped. Then, when it deals damage, he also draws 2 cards and discards a card. Mikayla plays an Overgrown Tomb untapped, paying 2 life, and then attacks William for 1 with Valentine and me for 2 with the Cliffhaven Vampire. When they deal damage, Mikayla gains a life and each of her opponents lose a life. Then, in her second main phase, she overloads Dam, destroying all creatures and exiling them because of the 2 separate Valentines. The only creature that survives is William's Stonehaven Outfitter. On Bilal's turn, he casts Trudge Garden, letting him pay 2 mana whenever he gains life to create a 4/4 Fungus Beast token. Then, at the end of turn, I cycle a Gilded Light. On my turn, I play a mountain and cast my commander Gavi Nest Warden, letting me cycle a card for free each turn and also creating a 2/2 dinosaur cat token when I draw my second card each turn. This allows me to cycle Quakefoot Cyclops for free this turn, creating a dinosaur cat. William casts Tajnar Swordsmith, paying 2 mana when it enters to search his library for an equipment, putting it onto the battlefield. This lets him put Black Blade Reforged into play and also equip it for free thanks to the Hammer of Nazan, equipping it to Stonehaven Outfitter, giving it +6/+6 since he controls 6 lands. He then attacks Mikayla for 11, and, to save herself some life, she activates Elixir of Immortality, shuffling it and her graveyard into her library and then gaining 5 life. Then, when William deals combat damage, he draws 2 cards and discards a card. At the end of his turn, I cycle a Miscalculation for free. On Mikayla's turn, she casts Auriok Champion, gaining a life whenever a creature enters the battlefield, and also casts Cosmos Elixir, gaining 2 life at the end of her turn unless her life is above her starting life total. Then she draws a card. At the end of her turn, she gains 2 life. Bilal plays a forest and casts his commander Beladros Witherbloom, but unfortunately for him, in response, I cycle a Complicate, which counters the spell unless he pays 1, which he can't, so Beladros is countered. On my turn, I play a mountain and cycle Choking Tethers, tapping William's Swordsmith and creating another dinosaur cat. I then attack William for 4 with Gavi and a cat, and in my second main phase, I cast Astral Drift, letting me exile a creature and return it to play at the next end step whenever I cycle a card. William plays a Fortified Village and casts Beast Within, destroying my Astral Drift, but making me a 3/3 Beast token. In response, I cycle Windcaller Aven, giving my untapped dinosaur cat flying and exiling William's Stonehaven Outfitter. Once that's resolved, William casts a Segovian Angel, then he also casts Fleet Feather Sandals, equipping them to the Angel, giving it haste and flying, allowing him to attack me with it for 1. Then at the end of turn, his Outfitter returns to play. This lets me, still at the end of his turn, cycle an Angel Song, paying 1 to do 2 damage to the Outfitter, killing it and making another dinosaur cat. Mikayla casts her commander Tyam Luminous Enigma, letting each of her other creatures enter with a vigilance counter on them, and also gaining her a life. In response, I cycle a Desert of the Fervent, then her commander resolves. She also casts Trelasara Moondancer, which enters with a vigilance counter, and then also gets a +1/+1 counter, and lets Mikayla scry 1 whenever she gains life. Since this triggers Auriok Champion, she immediately gains a life, scries 1, and puts a +1/+1 counter on Trelasara. Finally, in her end step, she gains 2 life from Cosmos Elixir, putting yet another counter on Trelasara and scrying 1. Bilal casts Coveted Jewel, drawing 3 cards and also passing the jewel to anyone who attacks him but isn't blocked. After that, he casts Kodama's Reach, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting 1 into his hand and the other into play tapped. At the end of turn, I cycle a Rune of Protection Black. On my turn, I move straight to combat, attacking Bilal for 3, gaining control of the Coveted Jewel, untapping it, drawing 3 cards, making another dinosaur cat, gaining Mikayla a life, putting a counter on Trelasara, and letting her scry 1. Then, in my second main phase, I play an island and cast Ruin Grinder, which lets everyone discard their hand to draw 7 cards when it dies. This also gains Mikayla a life, puts a counter on Trelasara, and lets her scry 1. Finally, I cast Crystalline Resonance, which can become a copy of any creature until my next turn whenever I cycle a card. William equips Hammer of Nazan to Segovian Angel, giving it +2/+0 and indestructible, and then attacks me for 3 with the Angel, gaining control of the Coveted Jewel, drawing 3 cards and untapping it. In his second main phase, he plays a Rogue's Passage, and then casts Blood-Forged Battle Axe, equipping it to Tajnar Swordsmith. This gives it +2/+0 and also creates a copy of the axe when it deals combat damage to a player. After that, he casts Oran Viper, which has Death Touch, and also draws William a card when it deals combat damage to a player. This gains Mikayla a life, puts a counter on Trelasara, and lets her scry 1. Finally, he re-equips Fleet Feather Sandals to the Viper, giving it haste and flying. Mikayla casts Sakura Tribe Elder, gaining a life, scrying 1, and putting a counter on Trelasara. Then at the end of turn, she draws a card with Cosmos Elixir. On Bilal's turn, he casts his commander, Beladros Witherbloom, which creates a pest token in each upkeep and also allows him to pay 10 life once a turn to untap all his lands. Once that resolves, he immediately pays 10 life, untapping all of his lands, while Mikayla gains a life, scries 1, and puts a counter on Trelasara. He then casts Massacre Worm, giving all his opponent's creatures -2/-2 until the end of turn, and also making each opponent lose 2 life when one of their creatures dies. In response, Mikayla sacrifices Sakura Tribe Elder, searching her library for a basic land and putting it into play tapped. Then the worm resolves and winds up wiping away most creatures, and then I lose 8 life, William loses 2, and Mikayla loses 2, but she still does get to gain 1, scry 1, and put a counter on Trelasara. At the end of Bilal's turn, I cycle a Decree of Justice and also a Dranith Healer, making a Dinosaur Cat. In my upkeep, Bilal creates a pest token, then I play a Plains and cast Drake Haven, allowing me to pay 1 whenever I cycle a card to create a 2/2 Drake token with flying. I immediately cycle Flame Blitz, making a Dinosaur Cat and also paying a mana to make a Drake. I then cast a Dranith Stinger, which does 1 damage to each opponent whenever I cycle a card. Finally, I move to combat, attacking William for 7, gaining control of the Coveted Jewel, untapping it, and drawing 3 cards. In William's upkeep, Bilal makes another pest token, then William plays a Plains, and casts Divine Reckoning, making each player choose one of their creatures and destroying the rest. With the spell on the stack, he also casts Blacksmith's Skill to give Oran Viper hexproof and indestructible until the end of turn. William then chooses his Swordsmith, Mikayla chooses Tyam, Bilal chooses Beladros, and I choose Gavi. Then all the other creatures are destroyed. Bilal gains 2 life when his pests die, paying to make a 4/4 beast, and unfortunately, Massacre Worm sees all the creatures die, so Mikayla loses 2 life and I lose 10. Then, since Ruin Grinder dies, we all get the option of discarding our hands to draw 7 new ones. In response to that, though, I cast Zenith Flare, doing 16 damage to Bilal and gaining 16 life since I have 16 cards with cycling in my graveyard. Still before we discard, I cycle Yadara Wandering Monster, shuffling it back into my library, and pay 1 to make a Drake token. Finally, Ruin Grinder's effect resolves, and we all discard our hands to draw 7 cards. This should have triggered Gavi to make me a cat, but we missed that at the time. William then activates Rogue's Passage, giving his Viper unblockable so he can attack me for 1, drawing a card, gaining control of the Coveted Jewel, untapping it, and drawing 3 more cards. In his second main phase, he casts Leonin Shikari, letting him equip at instant speed. He then equips the Shikari with Mask of Memory, letting him draw 2 cards and discard a card when it deals combat damage to a player. Mikayla plays a Reliquary Tower, giving her no maximum hand size, while Bilal also creates a pest token in her upkeep. She then recasts Essence Warden, letting her gain a life whenever another creature enters the battlefield, and also casts Timeless Witness, returning Guardian Project from her graveyard to her hand, gaining a life, scrying 1, and putting a counter on Trelasara. Then at the end of turn, she gains 2 life from the Cosmos Elixir, scrying 1, and putting another counter on Trelasara. Still at the end of turn, I cycle Yadara Wandering Monster for the second time, turning Crystalline Resonance into a copy of Beladros Witherbloom. In Bilal's upkeep, both he and I make a pest token, letting Mikayla gain 2 life, scry 1 twice, and put 2 counters on Trelasara. He then plays Yavimaya Cradle of Growth, making each land a forest in addition to its other types, and moves to combat, attacking William for 4 with Beladros, gaining control of the Coveted Jewel, untapping it, and drawing 3 cards. In his second main phase, he casts Pristine Talisman, followed up by casting Honor Troll, gaining him an extra life every time he would gain a life, and this also gains Mikayla a life, letting her put a counter on Trelasara and scry 1. Bilal then casts Roiling Regrowth, sacrificing a swamp to search his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. At the end of Bilal's turn, I pay 10 life for my copy of Beladros to untap my lands. This lets me cycle Secluded Step, paying 1 to make a Drake, paying another 1 to do 2 damage to Essence Warden, killing it, and also turning Crystal Resonance into a copy of Drake Haven. Once that's resolved, I cycle Rune of Protection artifacts, making a Dinosaur Cat and paying 2 mana to make 2 Drakes. Finally, I basic land cycle an Ash Barrens, putting a Plains into my hand and paying 1 to make yet another Drake. Then when we move to my turn, Bilal creates a pest token in my upkeep, and I move straight to combat, attacking Mikayla for 8 and Bilal for 2 with my Drakes, taking control of the coveted jewel, untapping it, drawing 3 cards, and creating another dinosaur cat. In my second main phase, I cast Curator of Mysteries, letting me scry 1 whenever I cycle or discard a card, and I also cast Ominous Seas, which gets a Foreshadow counter when I draw a card and can create an 8/8 Kraken token by removing 8 counters from it. Finally, I cycle Remote Isle, scrying 1, paying 1 to make a Drake, and putting a counter on Ominous Seas. In William's upkeep, Bilal creates another pest token, and then William casts Balan, Wandering Knight, immediately activating her ability, attaching all equipment he controls to it, making her a 20/16 with Indestructible, Flying, Haste, and Double Strike. He attacks Bilal for 18 with Balan, knocking him out of the game on the first strike damage, drawing 2 cards, discarding a card, and copying the Battle Axe. At the end of turn, I cycle Rune of Protection Blue, scrying 1, putting a counter on Ominous Seas, and paying 1 to make a Drake. Mikayla plays a Godless Shrine untapped, paying 2 life, and casts Vizkopa Guildmage, which can be activated to give target creature lifelink until the end of turn, or be activated to make each opponent lose life equal to the life she gains this turn. She activates both of the Guildmage's abilities, giving Trelasara lifelink and making each opponent lose life equal to the life she gains. In response, I cycle Nimble Obstructionist to counter one of the abilities, preventing Trelasara from getting lifelink. This puts a counter on Ominous Seas, and then I scry 1 and pay 1 to make a Drake. Mikayla then attacks me for 15 with Trelasara, but I block with my Pest, gaining a life when it dies. At the end of turn, Mikayla gains 2 life, puts a counter on Trelasara, scries 1, and makes each opponent lose 2 life. Finally, I cycle a Hollow 1, scrying 1, putting a counter on Ominous Seas, making a Dinosaur Cat, and paying 1 to make another Drake. Then, when I draw for turn, I put a counter on the Seas, cast a Reconnaissance mission, letting me draw a card whenever one of my creatures deals combat damage to an opponent, allowing me to attack Mikayla for 22 damage with all of my flyers, drawing a total of 10 cards when they deal damage, putting 10 counters on Ominous Seas, and creating a Dinosaur Cat. Second main phase, I cycle Starstorm, scrying 1, putting another counter on the Ominous Seas, and then cast Astral Slide, letting me exile target creature whenever any player cycles a card, returning it to play at the end of turn. On William's turn, he plays a Plains and recasts his commander Nazan, searching his library for an equipment, in this case Basilisk Collar, putting it into his hand. He then casts the Basilisk Collar, equipping it to Balan, giving her Death Touch and lifelink. He attacks Mikayla for 22 total damage with Balan, knocking her out of the game and gaining 22 life. This also triggers Mask of Memory, letting him draw 2 cards and discard a card. In William's end step, I cycle a Valiant Rescuer, exiling Oran Vampire, putting a counter on Ominous Seas, and paying 1 to make a Drake token. Still at the end of turn, I cycle a Censor, exiling Nazan, putting a counter on Ominous Seas, creating a Dinosaur Cat, and paying 1 to make a Drake. In response, William casts Tamio's Safekeeping on Nazan, gaining 2 life and giving Nazan hexproof and indestructible until the end of turn, preventing him from being exiled. Finally, I remove 16 counters from Ominous Seas, creating 2 8/8 Kraken tokens. On my turn, I cast Herald of the Forgotten, returning all permanents with cycling from my graveyard to the battlefield. For the sake of not reading out all 17 cards, the most important ones are Quakefoot Cyclops, which prevents 2 of William's creatures from blocking this turn, and Cast Out, which exiles William's last blocker. This allows me to attack William for 54 total damage with all of my tokens, winning me the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Hopefully you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed playing it. Definitely got to see our deck do some amazing things, and really everybody's deck kind of did something super cool. William's deck really put a ton of equipment on board and was a massive threat early on. He even knocked out 2 of the 4 players at the table, so that alone is pretty impressive. Mikayla had gained a ton of life throughout the course of the game and just kind of kept floating around her starting life total. None of us could really get her below it, so that was very, very impressive as well, especially once that Trelasara got super big and she was threatening to kind of knock people out with it and the Vizkopa Guildmage, so super cool stuff to see. And then finally, Bilal and his Beledros deck. He didn't quite get to do everything he wanted to do because we tried to keep his life total as low as possible so that he couldn't access Beledros. But I think that if he had had the Massacre Worm again, and he mentioned right before he got knocked out of the game that he had a way to reanimate it, that pretty much would have knocked out the rest of the table. So very cool showing from his deck as well. But of course, we got to talk about our deck, and I think that the $20 cycling deck really performed above and beyond my expectations. It was super cool to see us rebuild from board wipes and make sure that we're just making a ton of tokens and drawing a ton of cards and doing a ton of damage. And obviously, we didn't get super far in the game before we started running out of life because people were just hitting us and making sure that we were staying at a low life total. But the Zenith Flare really saved us in the end there. And before we go, though, I do have one quick question that I would like to ask everybody, because I got to one point in the game where I had Decree of Annihilation in my hand and chose not to cycle it because obviously the other players were not super happy with it. Mikayla had asked that I not cast it. Bilal kind of being relatively indifferent, as we may have seen him cast a Decree of Annihilation before. William also preferring that it not be cycled, wanting to keep his lands, obviously. And so I had chosen not to cycle it and instead use the Astral Slide, which eventually led to the victory at the end of the game. So obviously, that being our most expensive card in the deck, I suppose I would like to ask the question to everybody watching as to whether or not you think Decree of Annihilation is a worthy include in the deck, if it's something that you personally just don't want to see or just don't like to see in games in general. So let me know what you think, because I think it's very meta dependent and the people you're playing with, but I do want to highlight the fact that just because it is in the deck doesn't mean you have to cycle it. I discarded it to hand size at the end of turn, so something to keep in mind for your playgroup and the people you're with. But I do want to hear from the audience as well, if that's something that maybe shouldn't be included in the deck, if you think that it's just kind of up for debate. I'd love to hear it. I'm not trying to obviously start a whole debate over mass land destruction, but I am interested to see what people think. So please let me know what you think of the video, of the deck tech, overall, the game as well. And I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.